afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum, Oregon's premier public affairs forum. I'm Sue Thomas, president of City Club, and I welcome you all, those of you here at the Governor Hotel and those of you listening on KBPS or OPB radio or watching on cable television. Thank you for joining us today on Friday, December 4th for this week's Friday Forum. Today's speaker will discuss the many causes of Oregon's persistent unemployment problem. But first, some announcements. In consideration of those sitting close to you and those in our radio and television audiences, I ask that everyone who's not already done so, please silence your cell phone. Thank you. As always, we offer our appreciation to our Friday Forum corporate sponsors whose generous financial support make these time-honored City Club luncheons possible. This is the final forum of the 2009 fall quarter, so please join me in offering an especially big thank you to our sponsors for the last 3 months, Baron Liebman and Zimmer Gunsel Frasca Architects. If your company or firm would like to be a Friday Forum sponsor, please contact City Club staff at the back of the room or call the City Club office. We also have 2 new members in the audience today. I would like it if they would stand up. Please join me in welcoming Thomas Carnes and Shamia Fagan. The annual fund plays a significant role in sustaining City Club's civic engagement efforts and the work that we do to improve the community in our region. You don't need to be a member to donate to the annual fund. If you believe in our mission or attend our programs, your donation can improve our ability to engage the community in the issues that matter most. We encourage each of you to make a donation to support City Club and civic engagement today by filling out an envelope on the table or donating on our website, pdxcityclub.org. At next week's Friday Forum, public opinion researcher Adam Davis will share what Oregonians think about hot-button topics such as the economy and healthcare, and will discuss the attitudes that impede progress on these topics. And now to today's program. With joblessness at above 11%, Oregon's unemployment rate is among the highest in the nation. But even in years of rapid job growth, unemployment in Oregon often remains above the national average. Today's City Club welcomes Ayre, who will elaborate upon the numerous reasons why Oregon faces such consistent employment challenges. Ayre first joined Oregon state government in 1985 as a research analyst with the Employment Division. During the 1990s, he was the Oregon Economic Development Department's main research analyst. There he assisted with strategic allocation of regional funding and the designation of economically distressed areas. In 1999, he became the state employment economist for the Oregon Employment Department, where he analyzes statewide employment trends and helps other state agencies understand these trends. In addition to writing numerous articles about the economy and editing the statewide Oregon Labor Trends newsletter, today's speaker recently co-authored Oregon at Work, 1859 to 2009, a book about changing labor force patterns in Oregon over the past 150 years. In less than a week, Art will be leaving his current position and beginning a new job as a policy and budget analyst with the Oregon Department of Administrative Services. We're extremely pleased to have you with us here in your final week and one of your final appearances as the state employment economist. And now, please help me welcome to the podium Ayre.
Thank you, everyone. Well, it's good to be here. I want to start today by talking about the unemployment rate in this recession because I know it's on everyone's mind. And then I'll spend most of my time talking about the longer-term trends and reasons for high unemployment in Oregon. I'm sure none of you need to be reminded that Oregon has a high unemployment rate. Sue, of course, mentioned that just a moment ago. And in fact, I've been partially responsible for getting the word out. Once a month I come up to Tualatin and provide that information to the news media, and probably some of you may have seen me on the TV or on the radio, so heard me on the radio. The unemployment rate was particularly in the news in late 2008 and early 2009 when it was rising very rapidly. In fact, it went from a low of 5% back in early 2007 to around 12% in early 2009, so just 2 years later. It remained around 12% from March through August, and then in September and October the rate declined a little bit to 11.3%, but it's still very high by historical standards. At least it's no longer rising, though, as of since March. Of course, I'm talking about the statewide unemployment rate. We also produce estimates of unemployment rates in individual counties, and some of those are substantially higher than the statewide rate. For example, in October, in Harney County, the unemployment rate was estimated at 19%, and in Crook County at 18.1%. So I will talk more about rural counties in a little bit, but mostly I'm going to focus on statewide. Also, I've been talking about the official unemployment rate. There are other measures of what are called labor underutilization. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics produces 6 official measures of labor underutilization. One of them is the official unemployment rate, but there are 5 others, and the broadest of those is a measure that includes not only all those people who are considered to be unemployed, but also people who are working, but who are working part-time and want full-time work and can't get it because of economic reasons, because of the economy. It also includes, this broad measure also includes people who are not working and they're not looking for work and therefore would not be counted as officially unemployed, but they say they want a job, and therefore they are also considered to be underutilized. So if we look at this broad measure of labor underutilization for Oregon, and the Bureau of Labor Statistics just started producing these numbers very recently, within the past year, the measure for Oregon, this broad measure of labor underutilization for Oregon, measures around 20%, or about 1 in 5 people who are either working or want a job are considered to be underutilized by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. But again, this broad measure of labor underutilization is not the focus of my talk today. Instead, what I want to focus on is, as I said, the official unemployment rate, and I'll start out by describing what unemployment is by the official definition. Unemployment starts with the civilian non-institutional population. That is to say, it focuses on the population that is not in the active military, not in institutions such as correctional institutions or mental institutions, and is age 16 or older, so younger people are not included in that number. So for those people who are in the age 16 and older civilian non-institutional population, there is a monthly survey of households, and about 950 or 1,000 households in Oregon are participating in that, and those individuals are asked whether or not they are employed or are they looking for work. So a person who's counted as unemployed is someone who is in that civilian non-institutional population, does not have employment, is available for employment, and has actively searched for employment within the prior 4 weeks before being counted as unemployed. So that's a definition to help get us all on the same page. Now, some people wonder why Oregon has such a high unemployment rate in this recession. I think in some of the prior recessions that Oregon has had, it was a little more obvious why we had a high unemployment rate. For example, in the early 1980s, we were just coming off of a huge boom in housing. We had a very large burst in the housing bubble in the early 1980s and a financial problem, very high real interest rates. And so the loss of wood product manufacturing jobs in Oregon was a major factor, and of course also loss of construction jobs. But wood product manufacturing was a very large part of the Oregon economy at that time, and fell very hard during the early 1980s. In the early 2000s, it was more related to the bust in the high-tech industry and the dot-com bust. In this recession, it's a little bit more like the early 1980s. We had a housing bubble and some financial problems, a substantial reduction in lending, and the construction industry and the wood product manufacturing industry also declined in this recession. Like many other states, Oregon had a major increase in its construction employment between 2004 and 2007, and since then we've had approximately an equally large decline since then. Other parts of the reason for unemployment rate being relatively high during this recession appear to be our connection to California. We have pretty strong trade and migration ties with California. And California was heavily involved in that housing boom and downturn and suffered a very severe downturn, actually a bit earlier than Oregon and much of the rest of the nation did. In the most recent data that I have on the subject, which unfortunately are 2002, I'm eagerly looking forward to the 2007 data. Good things take a while. California was the single largest destination of our shipments to any other state. In fact, the value of our shipments to California alone, to that one state alone, exceeded by a fair margin the value of our shipments to all foreign countries combined. So our ties to California are pretty strong. And of course, California has been the single largest source of our in-migrants. So we do have a strong tie to California, and what happens there does affect the Oregon economy. And as I said, California's economy was hit pretty hard in this recession, in this downturn. Another reason for a high unemployment rate in Oregon, not only in this recession, but in many recessions, is that Oregon tends to have a concentration in durable goods manufacturing. We have about 30%, maybe 35% more than what you might think of as our fair share of the nation's durable goods manufacturing. That's a sector of the economy that produces goods designed to last at least 3 years, and that's a sector of the economy that tends to be very cyclical. It drops faster in recessions, it rises faster in expansions. So this cyclical pattern helps explain why our unemployment rate tends to be higher during recessions, and thus there are some explanations. Our tie to California, our pro-cyclicity in durable goods manufacturing, there are some explanations for why Oregon's unemployment rate tends to be higher in this recession than some people might think it should be. But these explanations don't really go very far to helping us understand why Oregon's unemployment rate tends to remain rather high even during relatively good economic periods when we have strong job growth. And indeed, it has been fairly high over many years. Between 1978 and 2008, that's a 31-year period, Oregon's annual average unemployment rate was above the national average in 25 of those 31 years. That was the 7th highest frequency of all states, but it was tied with California and West Virginia, so we weren't there alone. California was right there with us with an above national average unemployment rate in 25 of those 31 years. Washington was actually even a little bit worse. It was above the national average in 27 years out of those 31. You can also look at it over that same period from the perspective of the number of years that we were in the top 10 states for unemployment rate. And Oregon was in the top 10 rates in the nation for more than half of those years, 18 of those 31 years. That was the 6th highest frequency of all states. And again, we were tied with California. Washington fared a little bit better. Washington spent a little bit less than half of those 31 years, about 14 years, in the top 10. So if our relatively rapid job growth during expansions, which I've already talked about, our durable goods manufacturing grows more rapidly during expansions, if that rapid job growth should help pull our unemployment rate down during expansions toward the bottom of all states, and yet our unemployment rate does not seem to be dropping during those expansions very much, there must be some other reasons, some other factors that are keeping our unemployment rate higher than we think it should be. And so that prompts the question, some people phrase it as what's wrong with Oregon. I would rather phrase it as why does Oregon have such persistently high unemployment rates? And this is an issue that I and some of my coworkers have wrestled with a little bit over the past several years. And we certainly haven't spent as much time as I would like to on it, but I do have some information to share with you, and I'm happy to be able to do that. I looked back in my files and I found that we brainstormed a number of different factors, actually a whole bunch, and I won't go into each one during this talk, I don't have time. But one of the first that we looked at was seasonality, and one of the reasons we looked at seasonality of our employment was that back in 2000 we published an article in Oregon Labor Trends relating to seasonality, examining Oregon's employment seasonality compared to Oregon and Washington and the nation as a whole. And that article, that analysis found that Oregon indeed does have more seasonal employment than these other states and the nation as a whole, and that contributes to our higher than average unemployment rate. And indeed, it also contributes, the seasonality also contributes to the higher unemployment rates in Oregon's rural counties in particular. Those rural counties tend to have more seasonality than the state as a whole, apparently probably because of their industry structure. They tend to have more agriculture, which is very seasonal, and some seasonal tourism and some portions of manufacturing that tend to be rather seasonal. More recent analysis over the past 8 years, looking at the past 8 years' data, showed that Oregon's seasonal employment gains and losses taken as a share of total state employment for each state were unusually high when comparing Oregon with other states. And this was true for a couple of industries. Those industries were natural resources and mining, which includes agriculture and logging and mining, and manufacturing. Now, in the natural resources and mining industry, Oregon's gains and losses were the second largest of all states. Again, that's gains and losses taken as a percent of total employment. This industry in Oregon is dominated by agriculture and logging, and agriculture is by far the more seasonal of the two, but logging is also quite seasonal. And national data indicate that Oregon has, that agricultural workers tend to have above average unemployment rates. Also, the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, reported for 2002 that Oregon was among the top handful of states for the highest level of farm expenses on hired and contract farm workers or farm labor. And so that suggests that Oregon has a relatively high concentration of farm workers. And as I said, the USDA also indicated that farm workers tend to have high unemployment rates. Mining is another part of the natural resources and mining industry, and in Oregon we don't have a whole lot of mining employment, but we do have some, and what we do have tends to be focused on or tied to construction, and that does also tend to be fairly seasonal. And the mining that we have in Oregon that is tied to construction tends to be fairly seasonal. Also, Oregon's seasonal employment gains and losses in the manufacturing industry, again, taken as a percent of total state employment, tend to be quite seasonal and very large. We were the fourth largest of all states in this measure. And actually, there are probably two of those states that were measured as being more seasonal than Oregon that probably shouldn't have been there, because they were Michigan and Rhode Island, and their manufacturing sectors were dropping very rapidly, and the way we measured seasonality was to take the high and the low for each year. And the high and the low for each year for substantial periods in those two states were essentially just a downward trend. It was not really seasonality, it was just a decline in the industry. So Oregon has a very large seasonality in manufacturing as well. And in manufacturing in Oregon, it is agricultural related, it's food processing that is driving that seasonality. Now, we did obviously find some explanation for Oregon's high long-term unemployment rate and seasonality, but we did feel the need to look further, and as I mentioned, we examined a lot of different factors. I'll talk about a few. One of them is demographics. Certainly we know that certain subcomponents, subsectors of the economy, demographic components of the economy tend to have higher unemployment rates. Young people in particular, and also racial and ethnic minorities tend to have higher unemployment rates. So the research question was, is our demographic composition something that is leading or adding to our high unemployment rate? In a nutshell, we really didn't find any evidence that our demographic characteristics make a difference in that regard. Another factor we examined was the rate of change in employment. Now, obviously, there is a relationship between employment growth and decline and unemployment rate, at least on a short-term basis. In fact, back in December of 2000, we published an article that showed the relationship between employment growth, population growth, and unemployment rate. And in a nutshell, when population is growing more rapidly than employment, generally speaking, you have the labor force growing more rapidly than employment, and you have unemployment rising and higher unemployment rate. But the rate of change in employment tends to be a short-term factor, and we were looking for long-term factors. It was not well correlated with long-term unemployment rate. That is to say, there were other states that had less rapid employment growth that had lower unemployment rates. We also examined year-to-year population change, same reason, because it is related to unemployment rate on a short-term basis. But again, like with employment change, we found no relationship over the long term, or no real relationship over the long term between population change and unemployment rates. The December 2000 analysis that I mentioned a few moments ago also mentioned the possibility that state-to-state differences in unemployment insurance systems might have something to do with differences in unemployment rates. So we did examine that to some degree. We looked at differences state-to-state in the average and maximum weekly unemployment insurance benefit payment amounts, and again, found no meaningful relationship with long-term unemployment rates there. We also examined the possible effect of state per capita taxes. State minimum wage. I'll get to state taxes in a moment. We examined the possible effect of state minimum wages, both on a county level and a state level, and again found very little relationship. There was a slight positive relationship there, but it was very little. We also examined taxes per capita, state by state, and something similar to that, a slightly different take on that, the proportion of total earnings in each state that were within state and local government. But again, we found no meaningful relationship there. Another factor we examined was the degree to which unemployment rates are higher in more rural areas than in urban areas. And clearly within Oregon, rural counties tend to have higher unemployment rates than do the more urban counties. And I mentioned earlier, it appears that it's the industrial structure of those counties that has a lot to do with that. So the question there was, could Oregon's more rural character as a state as a whole have something to do with or help explain its higher unemployment rate? And it does appear that that is possible, at least with when we compare Oregon with California and Washington. The counties in California and Washington that had more workers than Oregon's largest county, which is Multnomah County, of course, in terms of labor force, also tended to have lower unemployment rates and caused those neighboring states, California and Washington, to have lower overall statewide unemployment rates, at least during the last decade or so. And so in examining this, I found that if you removed these large counties' data out of California and Washington statewide data, you would get a remainder of state value that was much more like Oregon's. So there was some explanation there, some explanatory power in terms of Oregon's ruralness, our tendency towards small counties as opposed to the big king counties and Los Angeles counties of Washington and California. Now, why should rural counties have higher unemployment rates? I alluded to this earlier. Seasonality of an economy is a factor in unemployment rate, and rural counties tend to have more seasonality than urban counties do. And again, their industrial structure, their concentration of agriculture and seasonal tourism and some portions of manufacturing are probably a portion of that. Another reason for higher unemployment rates in rural counties is probably, and we don't have good measures on this, but it's probably the difficulty in finding work within a reasonable commute. If you lose your job in a rural county, it's going to be, I would think, much more difficult to find a replacement for that within a rural county, within a reasonable commute, than it would be in a large urban county. Unfortunately, the analysis that showed that Oregon's rural character helps explain its higher unemployment rate breaks down a little bit when we compare Oregon with even more rural states to our east, such as Idaho or even all the way back to North Dakota. Those states tend to have lower unemployment rates, and they are substantially smaller and more rural than Oregon is. So, and one of the things that I noticed as I looked at the map of the United States and its average unemployment rates by state is that many of the more rural states that had persistently lower unemployment rates tended to be in the upper or the northern mountain states and the northern plains states. And I was wondering if this regional climate issue might be a factor. I was able to find some climate-related data from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which produces data on heating and cooling degree days for states. And heating and cooling degrees are essentially a measure of the degree to which an area's or a state's average daily temperature differs from a moderate temperature, like 65 degrees. Essentially, these are based on a daily basis, added up over the year, and you get a measure of the severity of the climate of an area. And these data are averaged over many years, and they are weighted toward the population centers. So in Oregon, these data would be weighted toward Portland and the Willamette Valley, where our population tends to be. So I compared these data with measures of climate, these measures of climate with measures of unemployment rate over many years, and found that there was a moderate inverse relationship. The data suggests that a milder climate tends to be related to higher unemployment rates. Now, there are two notable exceptions, Alaska and Hawaii. Alaska has a severe climate, and yet it has a relatively high unemployment rate, and Hawaii has the opposite. But given their physical separation from the rest of the United States, I felt that they could be treated as exceptions that didn't disprove the rule, and that there was still this reasonable relationship between climate and unemployment rate over a long period of time. Now, one reason a mild climate may be associated with higher unemployment rate is that a mild climate is likely to be more attractive to many people, and it may be attractive enough to encourage them to tolerate more frequent and longer periods of unemployment. And by the way, climate is only one measure, or only one of many characteristics that make a state attractive and that may encourage people to come and stay despite high unemployment rates. These other characteristics may include geographic diversity, abundant recreational opportunities, and an attractive cultural life, and I think Oregon has all three of those. Our state's geographic diversity, I think, is fairly obvious. Our recreational opportunities, I think, are also fairly obvious, and they do tend to show up a little bit in the statistics. I was looking for any evidence of that, and I found that Oregon ranks 16th highest among all states for our share of total employment in sporting goods stores, so people out there taking advantage of the out of doors and provisioning themselves at sporting goods stores. And Oregon ranked 7th highest of all states for the share of total employment in recreational vehicle parks and recreational camps. So again, people taking advantage of the out of doors, and it's a feature of Oregon's attractiveness. Other aspects of Oregon's attractiveness, I think, show up in rankings of the best places to live. And I did a little research in preparation for this talk on the internet, and found just recently that Portland was recently ranked one of the top 10 greenest cities, one of the top 10 best cities for seniors, the #1 most sustainable city, the 5th cleanest of the nation's top 49 metro areas, and the nation's 3rd best city to live in. So with such a good reputation, is it any wonder that people are moving here, and not only to Portland, but Oregon in general? United Van Lines has a link on their homepage to the results of their migration study for the first half of 2009. Now, this study that United Van Lines does reports the percent of cross-state moves that United Van Line does that were inbound into the state. And their study from the first half of 2009 said, and I quote, "The District of Columbia, with 63.8% inbound, maintained its position as the most popular inbound destination, up 1.5 percentage points in the past 6 months, and a clear winner ahead of Oregon, with 59.3% inbound, which has experienced high inbound migration for 21 consecutive years." So United Van Lines is saying that Oregon has experienced high inbound migration for the last 21 years. If we go back to the year-end 2008 data from United Van Lines, we find that Oregon had a 55.6% inbound movement, and that ranked 8th highest overall. Now, for those of you who have forgotten already, the first half of 2009 didn't really look all that good in terms of Oregon's economy, and yet the percentage of inbound movements to Oregon, based on United Van Lines data, went from 55.6% for 2008 to 59.3% for the first half of 2009. So people are coming here despite the fact we don't have a particularly robust economy at this point. Also, U-Haul provides some data. They ranked Portland the 6th highest of all major cities for the number of inbound moves that were of more than 50 miles in 2008. Now, this is not adjusted for size of city, but certainly Portland is not the 6th largest metro area or city in the nation, and yet it had the 6th highest number of inbound moves from U-Haul. Now, this might be a good place to pause and recap a bit. I mentioned that our research identified seasonality, rural character, and climate as factors in our persistent above-average unemployment rate. But of course, we also looked at long-term structural change in the economy. This is something that seems obvious to look at, and we did look at it. Specifically, Oregon has had a substantial structural change over the last 20 or 30 years. I mentioned the early 1980s when our wood products industry declined very substantially. Not only in the early 1980s, but also in the early 1990s with the northern spotted owl issue and the reduction in timber harvest in Oregon. And then in the last couple of years, with the downturn in the housing situation, wood products again went down very strong. So the question there is, has the decline in wood product manufacturing in Oregon had a substantial impact on Oregon's unemployment rate? And has that contributed to this long-term persistent high unemployment rate? The analysis that I did started with overall manufacturing employment. And I guess before I go into that, I'll say that in my mind, there is no question that this downturn in employment in the wood products industry has contributed to unemployment in Oregon, and by that has contributed to some degree to the long-term unemployment rate in Oregon. But as I examined Oregon's loss of jobs in manufacturing between 1990 and 2008, I found that as a share of total state employment, Oregon's downturn in manufacturing over that period was milder than in 33 other states. We actually have fared better over that period in manufacturing than did many other states. Also, if we zero in and look just at wood product manufacturing and the downturn in that industry over that period of time, because we know that some other manufacturing industries have risen over that time and taken and ameliorated the downturn in manufacturing. If we look just at the loss of wood product manufacturing and take that decline as a share of total employment and compare that to other states' downturn in their manufacturing sectors, we find that 18 other states had more severe downturns in some portion of their manufacturing sector than Oregon had in wood product manufacturing. So while I know in my heart that job loss in the wood product industry in Oregon has added to unemployment and our long-term unemployment rate, it doesn't stand out as a major factor. These other factors that I've mentioned earlier appear to be at least equal, if not more important than the downturn in our wood product sector and in our industrial restructuring. In fact, if we look at a recent period, the 2004 to 2006 period, when Oregon was adding jobs at a moderately rapid pace, we were adding jobs at about 2 to 3% between 2004 and 2006. We were coming back out of that recession, the early 2000s recession. And wood product manufacturing was very stable, actually going up a little bit. The state's unemployment rate remained at least 9th highest in the nation. So obviously there are other factors at play than downturn in or stability or job growth in Oregon's unemployment rate. And so I'd like to close by saying that the research I've done on the subject of Oregon's persistently high unemployment rate really only scratches the surface. I haven't had as much time as I would like to delve into this issue. There are lots of opportunities to examine this further. Specifically, some of the analysis I didn't use as many years worth of data as I would have liked. And also there could well be other factors that we didn't think of that could be important explanatory variables in our persistently high unemployment rate. However, I hope the research that we have done and that I've presented to you today has helped clarify a little bit some of the factors, at least some of the factors, that contribute to Oregon's high unemployment rate. Thank you very much.
The first question for our speaker, as always, will be from our City Club host. Our host today is City Club Governor Ted Kaye. Ted is Vice President for Finance at Teledirect International here in Portland. A City Club member since 1990, Ted received a City Club President's Award in both 2008 and 2009. Ted is the club's treasurer and a member of the Development Committee. Ted?
Thank you. You touched on this. I want you to give us more. Oregon has the second highest state minimum wage, 16% higher than the federal minimum wage. To what extent does that affect our state's unemployment rate, especially among young and unskilled workers?
Well, as I mentioned, we did look at minimum wage across all states, and we found a small but positive correlation between minimum wages and unemployment rates. We didn't examine unemployment rates by age group, so I can't speak directly to that portion of the question, but there has been a lot of study of minimum wage and whether or not it makes a difference to job growth. I believe there has been some analysis as to whether it makes a difference to unemployment rate. And the research, as I understand it, has been very equivocal, has been difficult to come to any conclusion on this issue. And one of the possible reasons for that is that as you raise a minimum wage, you provide more income to people who are likely to spend that income in the local economy. And as you do that, you may offset some of the otherwise negative effects of raising the cost of labor. You may actually increase some of the local demand. So I think that's one aspect of research that could be focused on a little bit more. I haven't seen anything that really delves into that portion of the issue, but as I say, there are a number of studies on whether or not a minimum wage makes a difference, particularly to job growth, and there has not been much in the way of conclusive evidence that it does.
We'll now take questions from the floor. Asking questions at Friday Forums is a privilege of City Club membership. When you ask your question, please identify yourself as a City Club member and ask your question in 30 seconds or less.
Matteo Luccio, City Club member. as of today, after a hiatus of about 10 years. You focused on the causes of unemployment. I'm wondering what unemployment in turn drives, some of the obligations and other variables. I mean, obviously unemployment compensation, that's a direct relationship. But are there some other state obligations and variables that are pegged to unemployment, to the unemployment figure?
Well, I'm not sure I understand the implications of the question. Other variables, not causes of unemployment rate, but rather...
What does unemployment drive in turn, in terms of various state obligations and,
Well, again, I haven't studied that in depth. Obviously, as you mentioned, it does make a very big difference to unemployment insurance compensation. Our agency is the source of that. We manage the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund and the Unemployment Insurance Benefit Program, and those numbers have gone, as you can imagine, through the roof. I don't remember exactly what the statistic was, but it was a very large dollar figure, and put unemployment insurance benefits as one of the largest, if it were an industry, one of the largest industries in the state. But obviously unemployment, high unemployment is likely to reduce personal income tax revenues, and that filters through to state budgets and the ability to provide public services. So that's a very general answer, and I'm sorry I can't be more specific than that.
Peter Fenner, member of the City Club. Technology has obviously been creating more jobs in the past 10 years than any other factor. Do you have any information or thoughts on what Oregon does or doesn't do relative to creating technology jobs that might be a solution to some of the issues?
Technology has, of course, replaced some jobs, but it also provides the jobs for those people who make the technological goods. There was a study done back in the, I think, the late 1980s regarding the downturn in the wood products industry in the early 1980s that identified changes in technology and automation as one of the substantial factors in the downturn of employment in the wood products industry. But at the same time, of course, we all know that we have had substantial increase in some portions of our manufacturing industry. Computer and electronic products is obvious. Also machinery is a pretty important manufacturing industry in Oregon, and transportation equipment. So there are a lot of portions of Oregon's economy that are related to building the technology that is used by other industries. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, we do have a concentration in durable goods manufacturing. We have 30 or 35% more than the normal national share for that industry. And so we are concentrated to some degree in producing this technology that is used by businesses in most cases to produce goods and services. So that is something that supports jobs here in Oregon, even while it in some cases does displace workers and requires them to find other types of work.
Tom Nielsen, City Club member. The segment you were just talking about, the high-tech and manufacturing segment, seems like over the last not too many years has really been diminished because of global competitiveness and outsourcing to low-cost centers, either within our nation or offshore. Right. Did you look at that issue? It seems like, just to follow up, it seems like those are almost permanent losses.
Yes, we looked at that in the same context as the downturn in the wood products industry, and the high-tech industry peaked in around 2000. It dropped very hard in that recession of 2000 to 2003, and came back to some degree, but has since dwindled a bit. And I didn't zero in on that industry as much as wood products, but it does appear that that has contributed to the unemployment rate over the past 5 to 10 years.
Steve Novick, City Club member. Mr. Ayre, thank you very much for a fascinating presentation. There's a debate going on now over a couple of tax measures where one side says that if we raise taxes a bit in corporations and rich people, the unemployment rate will explode. As I look around the country, I see, for instance, Florida has lower taxes on rich people and corporations than New York, but has a higher unemployment rate. North Carolina has lower taxes on corporations and rich people than Iowa, but has a higher unemployment rate. Do you have any comment on the theory that it's specifically taxes on corporations and rich people that are the sole determinant of unemployment rates?
Well, I think your question begs the answer. The sole determinant of unemployment rates, I think, is obvious. No, there are other factors as well. As I mentioned earlier, I did look at taxes per capita. We didn't look at the tax structure state by state. I think that would be very difficult to do. But we looked at the overall taxes per capita, and as I mentioned, the earnings by state and local government employees as a percent of total earnings, and those should have some correlation with the overall tax structure of the state economies that we looked at, and we really didn't find any relationship there. So that doesn't mean that there couldn't be some relationship if we looked closer, and I think at the end of my presentation I mentioned that there is fertile ground here for more research and more analysis that we didn't have time to do and perhaps didn't have the expertise to do, but at this point I would not be able to say that taxes have any direct bearing on unemployment rate.
B.J. Seymour, City Club member. You've given us a lot of very good information on the seriousness of our unemployment rate. Any suggestions on what we can do to make things better?
Well, that's a very good question, and it's one that I think I would defer to the policymakers to address. We have a legislative system that I think is very good at bringing forward ideas from the public, bringing them into the public hearing rooms, and getting people to comment from all sides of an issue and suggest ideas on ways to address issues that are before the legislature. As I mentioned during my presentation, as I alluded to perhaps, I didn't sum it up this way, but I'll perhaps give it this spin at this point. I mentioned during my presentation that some people phrase the question, what's wrong with Oregon? And you may have gotten the impression as I went through my presentation that it may not be so much a matter of what's wrong with Oregon, but what are the special characteristics about Oregon that cause it to have a high unemployment rate? It may not be something that's really wrong with the state. It may be just that we are on the West Coast, a desirable place to be. We have a relatively rural economy, and in some cases I think people do seek out a rural lifestyle and may be willing to put up with the more frequent and more persistent unemployment to enjoy some of the benefits of that rural lifestyle. So in some cases we seek to solve a problem that may not really be solvable, and the people who would be affected by the solution may not want.
Mike Litt, City Club member. One of the approaches to solving our employment problems that has been used extensively is to attract corporations to move to our state from other places in the world. There's recently, however, a new concept that I became familiar with very recently called economic gardening, in which instead of economic hunting, where you go out hunting to get a corporation to move into your state, where you grow the entrepreneurship and things that are already going on in your state. Do you have any comment about those contrasting ways of growing our economy?
Well, that's a question that I think people at economic development probably wrestle with a lot. I actually used to work at economic development here in Oregon, and I know that at that time we had programs that did both. We certainly responded to, and I think in some cases actually recruited out-of-state companies to locate in Oregon. And we also had programs that were designed to encourage the growth of existing companies here in Oregon and actually help people get into a business situation. For example, there are the small business development centers in Oregon. There used to be, I'm not sure if it's still active, but the micro enterprise development effort. And I don't really have research at this point that says whether or not one is more successful than another in terms of an approach. I think both of them probably have had successes at times in some areas, but certainly we've also seen some situations where large companies have come into an area, have been there for a while, and then have left, and that has created some dislocation when they leave. So there certainly are not I wouldn't say the solution is one or the other. I think there could be a combination of both that works for in the quiver of an economic development policy.
Leslie Moorhead, a City Club member. The unemployment numbers have gotten the front page of the New York Times again this morning, and the White House is saying this is good, that we've only lost 11,000 jobs in the last month on the national level. So I want to ask you this question because I think I have the numbers on the national scale in mind, but if you would answer it in terms of Oregon, that would be helpful to us. I remember not long ago, maybe less than 2 years ago, we were losing hundreds of thousands of jobs on the national level each month, and that adds up to millions and millions of people. So my basic question is, what happened to all these people? The real question is, can you remind us of the Oregon picture of the most jobs we've lost over this last recession, which I think is going on 2 years now, the fewest jobs are where we are now that we've lost in terms of a month, and how long people stay in the pipeline? What do you think has happened to all the Oregonians who have lost jobs, and how are we going to reabsorb them back into the culture of this employment base of the state?
That's a multifaceted. Am I still on? That's a multifaceted question. Over the last, since the end of 2007, when our employment peaked, we have lost about 120,000 jobs, or 7%. And actually, that's the total. That includes government sector, which has either not lost as many or has actually increased slightly over that time. The private sector has actually lost a larger percentage over that time. So I guess the government sector has gained over that time. So we've lost 120,000 jobs over the last roughly 2 years, or 7%. You ask where those people have gone. I don't actually know. We also know that that number does not include additional difficulties that people have had because their hours have been cut. So we've had additional people going from full-time employment to part-time employment. And this is something that means that the typical unemployment rate and job loss figures do to some degree understate the severity of the downturn. That's true not only in this recession, but in other recessions as well. During late 2008 and early 2009, we actually had a big surge in our labor force, meaning that there were a lot more people coming into the labor force, and that was a big question mark. We were wondering why was that happening. And I think a couple reasonable hypotheses there are that as people were losing their jobs, seeing their hours cut, worried about losing their jobs and having spouses and other family members losing their jobs or having hours cut, there were people who formerly were not in the labor force who jumped into the labor force to try to help out the family budget. There were also people who were seeing the capital markets go down very substantially, and those capital markets bottomed out in March of this year and started rising again, and soon thereafter, actually in April, we had our labor force peak and then start coming down again. And so some of the increase in the labor force and subsequent decline in the labor force could have been people who postponed retirement or actually came back into the labor force after retiring to try to secure a more comfortable economic financial position. But as the capital markets improved, starting in mid-March, I think and also the consumer confidence index improved right about that same time. It appears that people became more confident and decided that maybe they didn't need to be out looking for work, that things were going to work out okay anyway. But it still doesn't answer the question, what happened to those people who were employed back in late 2007 who are not employed now? Those people presumably are still unemployed, or they may have dropped out of the labor force. There have been a number of extensions to unemployment insurance benefits to the point where unemployment insurance benefits run for close to 2 years. That's a long time. Not everybody qualifies for that length of unemployment insurance benefits, but they have ratcheted up to the point where they are very long indeed. I think the maximum is over 90 weeks of unemployment insurance benefits. So some people are able to continue looking for work and maintain their situation with unemployment insurance benefits.
Helen Youngles, New York City Club member. One factor in the long run unemployment rate that you didn't mention is the structure of our labor force, our human capital, our education composition of our labor force, and I hope that you would talk about that, a factor in our unemployment rate.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that because there was an article just recently that suggested that the unemployment rate would be even higher nationally. The national unemployment rate would be even higher if we adjusted for level of education. That in this recession, compared, for example, to the early 1980s, we have many more people who have advanced degrees, or at least college degrees, and that on average, people with college degrees tend to have lower unemployment rates, so that when you segregate the economy out into, or the labor force out into groups of people by their educational levels, the unemployment rates are actually worse now in this recession at the national level than they were back in the 1980s. However, we have so many more people in the more educated groups that, taken as a whole, the unemployment rate is still at the national level a bit lower than it was back then. We certainly do have statistics that show that, on average, people with more education have lower unemployment rates and have higher average pay per worker. And that doesn't mean that there aren't good opportunities for people who don't have that kind of educational background, but on average, people who do tend to fare a bit better in our economy. That being said, in this downturn, really all educational groups have seen their unemployment rates rising very substantially. And we've seen the downturn in jobs go from construction and manufacturing to fan out to virtually almost all sectors of the economy. Now, there is the private educational and health services portion of the economy that remains fairly strong, that continues to post job gains, but in almost every other sector, which includes many people with advanced degrees, we've seen downturns. So people with higher education have not been spared in this downturn.
Salah Ansari, City Club member. I'm wondering that we are involved in two major wars as a nation. I'm wondering if that has been factored in terms of the state economy as to how that has impacted us here in Oregon.
Well, that's an interesting question. I believe the number of soldiers that Oregon has sent overseas is fairly small compared to our overall labor force, but analysis that I've done over the past suggests that there is a relationship, not necessarily a really tight one, but there does appear to be some relationship between national defense spending and Oregon's economy. And specifically, it appears that the higher defense spending years tend to be accompanied by slower growth in Oregon. Now, I'm referring to fairly long-term trends, and that isn't to say that in any 1 year or any 2 years that's going to be a relationship, but Oregon does not have a particularly strong posture in defense industries, and we don't have major military bases here. So defense spending appears not to come our way as much as it does to some other states. And so it appears that over the long term, periods with 10-year periods, which is what I was examining, 10-year periods with higher defense spending tend to help some other states, some certain group of other states that tend to have more defense industry and military bases more than Oregon.
Andrew Wheeler, member. I was reading Paul Krugman, who continues to say that we are not putting enough into the stimulus package, but then I hear at the same time that the stimulus package has not nearly been spent. I don't know what you have to do with that and who does have anything to do with that, but that seems to me it could be an important issue because the kind of work that comes with the stimulus package when it's kind of pick and shovel, if you will, is relatively high wage.
I would like to say that I do not have that $600 billion. And honestly, I have not looked into the schedule of spending of the stimulus. As I understand it, you're right. There was some $700 billion earmarked, and something like 100 or 150 billion of it has been spent. That's my understanding. I think I've heard some explanations of why that is, that some of those other monies actually are in the pipeline, but they're going in different directions. But honestly, I haven't looked into it to the point where I could offer more than that.
Kurt Wavering, member. You've touched on a number of the parts of the economy, wood products, manufacturing, certainly rural meaning, and sometimes agriculture itself. I'm wondering, what about tourism, and what's factor does that have in the state's economy and unemployment?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because this reiterates one of the points that I made at the end of my presentation, and that is that there's more work to be done, there's more research to be done. And I mentioned we examined seasonality. I mentioned part of the research that we did, but not all of it. I mentioned the part that actually showed something useful for my case. But I did also examine seasonality in leisure and hospitality, the leisure and hospitality industry, which many people think of as tourism, or the tourism industry. And there, of course, tourism or leisure and hospitality does tend to be somewhat seasonal. But when we compare ourselves to other states, we find that there are many other states that have more seasonal employment in leisure and hospitality than Oregon does. And so this raises the question, well, how can I point to natural resources and mining and manufacturing, the seasonality in those two major sectors, and say that's contributing to unemployment rate, when I don't also point to leisure and hospitality and say many other states had substantially more seasonality in leisure and hospitality than Oregon does, so why shouldn't those states have higher unemployment rates than Oregon? There is a bit of a contradiction there, a conundrum. I don't know. As I say, there's room for more research on that. We do know that certain portions of leisure and hospitality tend to be very seasonal, and those do tend to be more in the rural areas, particularly along the coast and to some degree Central Oregon. And so that it's logical that that would contribute to unemployment and unemployment rate. But as I say, there's more research that needs to be done there. And particularly the question, why do some other states have substantially more seasonality in their leisure and hospitality than Oregon does, and yet continue to have very low unemployment rates?
Tony Accarino, City Club member. It's my impression, although I may be wrong, that the interests, both economic and political interests of urban Oregon and rural Oregon may have been more closely intertwined prior to the 1980s, with urban areas providing credit for rural enterprises, and then urban areas in turn transforming some of those rural products into manufactured goods. But that economic and political relationship may have broken down over the past 30 years. Is there any truth to that impression? And if so, could you talk a little bit about it? And what do you see as the prognosis for the future in terms of more closely linking the economic and political interests of the state in both urban and rural areas?
I think that's a very good point. Back in the 1970s, obviously, the wood product industry was going great guns, the housing industry was going great guns, and Oregon was supplying a good portion of the nation's plywood and lumber. In fact, if I recall the figures correctly, Oregon was providing something on the order of about a third of the nation's plywood during that time. And those companies, although they were pulling resource out of rural areas, oftentimes tended to be located, some of them, the mills, located in somewhat urban areas, the Eugene-Springfield area, for example. And this was something that came more to my attention when I was helping National Geographic update a map of Oregon for school kids and identifying the location of resources. And we were trying to decide where to put the little icons, whether they belonged in the woods or in the cities. And as we were identifying where some of these activities were taking place, we realized that some of these very rural activities, like wood product manufacturing, were taking place in some rather urban areas. So I think back then in particular, more so than now, now that the wood products industry has declined as much as it has, there was more of a connection between the urban and rural areas. That may also, to some degree, have been true with agriculture as well. I don't know. But I think the second part of your question is what can we do to bring back that connection? And I honestly haven't thought that through. I don't know.
We've come to the end of our time for this week. Please join us next week when we learn about what really matters to Oregonians. And as we close, please join me in expressing our appreciation to today's speaker, Ayre. We're adjourned.